Hi everyone, thank you for coming along. My name is Eden, and for a few more weeks only, I'm the Vice President for Access and Academic Affairs at AUSU, the Students' Union here, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this discussion on decolonising the curriculum. And above all, I want to say thanks to our really wonderful student organisers for making this happen. What they've done has been an incredible organisational feat, putting on over 30 events in just one weekend with over 100 students involved in organising. I think it's a phenomenal achievement, and I'm super impressed with them, so thank you very much for doing this. It's really important that we have the space and platform to discuss issues that we're all aware haven't been given the platform that they should have been at Oxford previously. I'm hopeful that from these really important conversations we'll follow action, and it'd be really great to maybe talk at the end about what we can do as a result of these conversations. Over the course of the weekend, there have been many events, and this is the final of 4 core events that Beth mentioned. The first 3 focused on access to Oxford University, the role of the British school system, race and class, and in last night's keynote speech by Carmen Abulsi, the topic, A Real Education, What We Learn from the Anti-Colonial Struggle was discussed. And this morning there was a panel on decolonising space, looking at colonial symbols, iconography and material culture that surrounds us at Oxford. Now we reach an issue that in many ways underpins all of this, decolonising the curriculum. And in this panel we ask the question, can the subaltern speak at Oxford? To my mind this relates to everything that's happened so far. Who is welcome at Oxford, who feels able to speak, what ideas are valued, what kinds of cultural capital are valued, what knowledge is recognised, shared and people are made aware of. Why is it that some things are questioned at this institution and others aren't? So I'm really delighted that we're ending with this. So quickly going to introduce our 2 panellists. Firstly we have Professor Anki Mukherjee. Anki is a Professor of English and World Literature here at Oxford. She is the author of 2 books, Aesthetic Hysteria, The Great Neurosis in Victorian Melodrama and Contemporary Fiction, and What is a Classic? Post-Colonial Rewriting and the Invention of the Canon, which won the British Academy Prize for English Literature in 2015. She has edited 2 volumes, A Concise Companion to Psychoanalysis, Literature and Culture, and After Lacan, which is forthcoming. Her current book projects examine the relevance of psychoanalysis for the psychic maladies of the urban, poor in global and post-colonial cities. We also have Mel Zawuzu, who is a recent graduate of philosophy and politics from the University of Leeds and now serves as the education officer at Leeds University Union, pioneering the Why is My Curriculum White campaign on campus, which has actually become a national phenomenon. Mel is also an artist, using much of her spare time to write and perform grime music, and recently she headlined at the Galden takeover at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She's deeply passionate about imagining new forms of knowledge, new ways of being and becoming, and believes that a transformative education is one of the key ways of achieving this. We'll begin by hearing some opening remarks from each of the panellists, and then I'll chair some questions and discussion among the panel before opening up to the floor. I'm really keen that we hear as many voices as possible in this discussion, so please feel free to ask questions but also make any of your own comments and share them with the room, and hopefully we can have some really fruitful discussion as a result of that. So now first on to Anki. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me at the back? I'll project. So last December 2016, I received a warm invitation from the Oxford Union that read as follows. This House believes British education perpetuates racism. We have created this debate motion in order to re-evaluate the nature of the British curriculum and whether it has allowed the nurturing of racist ideas through its supposed Eurocentricity. So I was asked to speak for this motion. And my first thought was, a sort of selfish one, I wondered what it would say about my credibility as a person of colour, that I was an agent of the British education system which perpetuated racism directly or indirectly. And of course I couldn't imagine sort of speaking against this motion. I turned down the invitation not because the motion did not have validity, of course it did, but because the Oxford Union proposition opposition format doesn't allow for the nuanced and detailed and balanced, yet agonistic debate that this issue demands. So I want to first of all thank you, organizers of this wonderful event, and especially my students, Hannah and Maya, who sort of asked me to do this, for giving me a second chance to voice my thoughts on this very important topic. I want to make 2 points in my remarks. One is pedantic, the other pedagogical. And yes, both these words, pedantic and pedagogical, shamefacedly relate to the Greek root pedagogos, denoting a slave who accompanied a child to school. Good luck decolonizing that. So the pedantic comment first. In her epochal Can the Subaltern Speak?, the post-colonial theorist Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak borrows the concept of the subaltern from the Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who in his prison notebooks written during Mussolini's regime used the term to mean disaggregated groups and subordinate classes in southern Italy whose nascent social consciousness was vulnerable to the ideas, culture, and leadership of the state. Gramsci's account of the subaltern was first developed by a group of Indian historians called the Subaltern Studies Collective, which defined the subaltern as, and I find this a very useful definition, it's by an Indian historian called Ranajit Guha, defined the subaltern as the general attribute of subordination in South Asian society, whether this is expressed in terms of class, caste, age, gender, and office, or any other way. So the argument was that India had achieved self-governance without a concomitant social revolution in the class system. So Spivak's scholarship on the subaltern builds on the historical arguments of the Subaltern Studies Collective, but adds that their classic Marxist approach to social and historical phenomena effectively privileges the male subaltern subject as the primary agent of change. For those of you who know Spivak's argument, and I'm not going to dwell on this, this is, as I said, a sort of little pedantic point that I really felt the need to make. Her subaltern is a young middle-class woman who uses biopolitics to express the resistance she had no serviceable rhetoric or forum for. So she uses her body, she uses her suicide to speak to her own political ideology that did not fit neatly in either of the kind of alternatives of pro-colonial or anti-colonial discourses that she was pulled in different directions for. Spivak takes exception to the valorization of class politics at the expense of other forms of liberation struggles relevant to Indian social history, such as the women's movement, the peasant struggles, or the rights of indigenous minorities. And in her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, her hermeneutics of suspicion extends to terminology and methodology, which tend to bestow a false coherence on complex and disparate struggles of specific subaltern groups. The subaltern studies historians, Spivak warns, are in danger of insidiously objectifying the subaltern, of controlling, and I quote her here, through knowledge, even as they restore versions of causality and self-determination, unquote, to the subaltern. So it's very important, I think, to remember this cautionary note, this warning against objectifying the radically disenfranchised as a universalist, humanist figure of oppression, even as we mobilize this concept of the subaltern to form a basis of action, as we are doing here. So the second point, the pedagogical point, is about the curriculum debate. When I'm asked by colleagues at other universities, occasionally by journalists, if the way English literature is taught at Oxford is changing as a result of student demands to approach texts in ways that acknowledge gender, race, class more explicitly, my answer is, and it's a bit of a cop-out answer, it's yes and no. Universities are unlikely to have hair-trigger responses to student unrest, as change involves structural revisions, not just curriculum revision and expansion, but an overhaul of teaching, examining, and hiring strategies and hiring structures. In the Faculty of English, where we teach the history of literature and language from 650 Anglo-Saxon to world literature, chronology is Eurochronology to a large extent, and to situate oneself in literary tradition is to inhabit structures that are necessarily Eurocentric, patriarchal, classist, xenophobic, and sometimes racist. We can, of course, where relevant, read literature as textual as well as territorial inscription, and this has sort of been the burden of post-colonial studies. We are always mindful of literature's implication in a given culture's criteria and contestation of value. We also make, and by we I mean not just people working in post-colonial studies, but I think most of the scholars I know in the English faculty make a concerted effort to retrieve foreign and discredited literary forms and figures, proletariat and women's voices. And to be honest, these projects are not specific to Oxford, but they've been gathering mass in the last quarter of the 20th century in the Anglo-American Academy. The point I want to make is that substantive canon expansion, which I'm arguing we are doing in however imperceptible a way, this canon expansion is nothing without an informed critique of the canonical method, and I'm not sure that this critique is always there. I don't see an ideological clash in acknowledging a certain complexion of literary genealogy, as long as we don't perpetuate its politics by perversely denying the diversity of literatures in English in the post-colonial and global world. The impetus for the worlding of literature, treating it as embedded and embodied, has largely come from humanities scholarship, through the emergence of feminist, post-colonial, gender, queer, race, disability, and eco-critical studies, which also have vital activist dimensions. Events such as these, such as the Common Ground conversation, however, are a salutary reminder that we have to work harder to translate innovation in scholarship into renovated teaching practices, working not against the grain of institutions, but with their financial, administrative, and moral support. So finally, what do I do with the canon? I love most parts of it, that's why I teach English. I teach the undergraduates literary history papers from 1760 to the present. It's a somewhat insane range. In the Romantics paper, for instance, so the temporal markers for the Romantic paper are 1760 to 1830, Wadham students learn about post-colonial Jane Austen. They learn about Byron, Shelley, or Coleridge's self-situation as English poets and cultural arbiters in the mediated landscapes of an empire which included the Near and Far East. We look at Romantic women writers such as Barbauld, Moore, Wheatley, and the anti-slavery movements they both drew on and supported. We examine the politics of Thomas de Quincey's anxiety about cancerous kisses from Nilotic crocodiles. If you know Thomas de Quincey, you know what I'm talking about. Reading his anxiety about crocodiles, or the Malay, or kind of, the Dark Interpreter, with reference to Charles Nicholas Sigisbert Sonnini's travels in Lower and Upper Egypt, which moves quickly from the discussion on crocodiles to the, what he calls, unexampled deprivation and brutality of bestial Upper Egypt men. We read De Quincey also with Richard Burton's Arabian Nights, which uses the metonymic meanings of the crocodile in Sonnini's work. In the post-1830 papers, where the colonial context is unavoidable, my own vision, and especially the undergraduate paper that begins in 1910, my own vision of decolonizing the curriculum takes the form of confounding the core periphery or mainstream alternative boundary, which, in the guise of designatory practice, has been a tool of segregation and marginalization. I disregard it in the way I organize my master's teaching as well, where the taker of a course such as psychoanalysis and literature will find themselves reading Jacques Lacan's Anxiety Seminar with Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man or Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist. Speaking of postgraduates, I hope that the head of steam generated by events such as this will take into account the fact that our access and diversity campaigns, and I feel very privileged sitting next to two officers who are in charge of looking after these programs of two very different but also very prestigious universities. I hope we take into account the fact that access and diversity campaigns must be international in scope and ambition. There is a sort of contradiction in the way Oxford is very proud to be a world-class university, but thinks of access only in relation to the depredations of the British class system and also the British schema for race. So, my final sentence in my introductory remarks would be a plea for the intersectionality of home and the world as we fight for common ground. Thank you.
Hello everyone. The title of this discussion is Can the Subaltern Speak? And I guess my simple response to that is that the subaltern can indeed speak and have been speaking, but are yet to be heard by a problematic listener. And that listener is academia today. I recently gave a TED talk about decolonizing the curriculum. And in that I link 3 issues together that I think are pertinent to this discussion today. Firstly, the attainment gap that exists in this country that means that students of colour, especially black students, do worse in academic spaces. Secondly, I explored the link that has with our colonial history and a colonial curriculum. And finally, I interrogated the hierarchies put into place by that problematic listener, that is academia, of what forms of knowledge production should and can be valued, and who is the de facto producer of that knowledge. So as my introduction, I'll give an excerpt of that talk that I gave. So, across the country, we see young people of colour underachieving. Nationally, students of colour that attend university with the same A-level exit grades as their white counterparts are 16% less likely to achieve what is known as a good degree. However, I don't want to fall too deep into the argument of needing facts and figures to justify change in our education system, as we may indeed come to a place where the attainment gap closes, but that does not mean for one moment that inequality in education has ceased. It rather means that we are having to develop coping mechanisms to deal with an unrepresentative and colonial curriculum. It takes the resilience from us that our white counterparts do not have to build, a resilience that no young person should have to build. So what is education? I think that a lot of the time we take education to be this one constitute concept, and that is learning, and often manage to dismiss the thinking aspect of it. That education takes just as much, if not more, thinking and critical challenging than it does learning and consuming knowledge. I say this because I think a lot of the time, the education system in this country fears young people genuinely thinking outside of the box, thinking outside of Western knowledge, thinking in a way that will disrupt white supremacy. And this is problematic. We are in a system in which we think within Enlightenment concepts and take too many things as unquestionable knowledge, as opposed to the readiness to wholly challenge the very basis of the way that we think and live. How can we achieve emancipation if we do not question everything? You see, colonialism was not just the physical brutality and theft of land and resource, as I'm sure everyone knows. It was the project to take over the mind and the intellect of the colonial subject, to make an Ashanti king an obedient and vulnerable subject of whiteness. And the sun has not set on the British Empire. And one of the places that this is most pronounced is within our education system. Education crafts the people that lead our society, politically, industrially, socially, and so on and so forth. But it often goes unchallenged regarding what ideals, what beliefs, and what histories underpin it. So take Immanuel Kant, for example. He is known and understood as one of the key founders of modern morality. But what if I told you that this same man thought black people were less than human? The liberal response to this would be to say, yes, he was wrong, but we should be able to look beyond that and simply now extend his arguments for all those we now consider under the notion of humanity. But this line of argument is not doing one deeply pivotal thing. It is not challenging the very basis of how he could be racist and still conceive the idea of universal human rights. It begs questions such as, are human rights only conceivable if we exclude a certain demographic of people? And how deeply is racism rooted within our society today? These are questions that should be broached every time that we speak of theories that are created under such conditions. And we must question the way that we look at and value different forms of art. For instance, what is the real difference between Shakespeare and Stormzy? In my opinion, there's not much. There's no reason that Stormzy's deep, intricate, powerful work cannot be studied in lecture theatres across this country to help us understand the context in which people like myself grew up in, to help us understand what it means to be black and British. But a colonial bias is what stops this from happening. I recently wrote a paper for my master's looking at how UK grime music is a clear vehicle, is used as a vehicle by many young black British men, including Skepta and Dave, to theorise about intersectional feminism as critical inquiry through the way they speak of mothers and black motherhood in Britain. So my argument is that we look like this, we talk like this, and we are like this, but contrary to public belief, we're intelligent as hell, and we are dangerous. So let me do something a bit different and really try and challenge the way that you see education. I want to be part of the revolution, never the institution. When I spit bars on my chains, they be loosened. It's a true thing that I'm a product of my environment, and I'ma say it straight that my environment is violence. But not just violence in a conventional kind of way, more than fist pumps in a conventional kind of way. It's that we do learn knowledge in that conventional kind of way. And that's the flipping violence, colonize my mind, people who look like me been silenced, erased from your history books, science and technology, and please, oh God, don't get me started on philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, even Socrates, or came to black people to learn what they preached, but white men were given all the credit. History's been manipulated with edits, all in the name of white supremacy. I hope you get it, so check it. Roads must fall, but the bankers still rule. They gave us 3 acres without no mule. Slavery is all we're ever taught. Black in Britain is never given a thought. They teach us, indoctrinate and feed us lies to the system needs us in questioning. Young black Brits to accept the situation and never challenge it. Liberal democracy is a man-made myth. Borders, nations, a whole lot of it. They came into our homes, raped, killed and pillaged, yet we're the ones they don't want in Britain. Empire was so bloody great. We gave you education and don't forget the trains. We civilized you. Board and a chalk, knife and a fork, but don't want heart by them sodomy laws. We're all just products of the British Empire where the sun never sets, so it's fought to inspire. But they dehumanized everybody with a shade so dark. Why do you think people of colour have it so damn hard? They all still benefit of the heinous crimes of the British Empire. The colonial sun still shines. Asking people to decolonize their minds, and no longer you would have just heard this girl from South East London trying to come to Oxford and spit some bars. You would have heard poetry. You would have heard deep critical inquiry. You would have heard subversion. You would have heard the analysis of some of the most critical points in our modern history. You would have heard philosophy. You would have heard wordplay. You would have heard the result of years of critical reading. You would have heard concepts as complex and important as homo-nationalism and neocolonialism. You will hear a tool towards changing our education system. You will have heard intricate references to Rousseauian social contract theory. You will have heard hope. You will have heard someone who is armed with a deeply critical mind. You will have heard someone who is plagued with a diasporic sense of lost. You will have heard a vehicle towards changing our education system. The Enlightenment period was the turning point in history. But look around the world today. Progress, in the liberal sense of the word, just simply isn't coming about. We need to allow our young people to open their minds, and we will see something even more magnificent and socially changing than the Enlightenment project. Let us all work together towards a free and liberated education system, one that is decolonized and no longer centers the knowledge produced solely in the white West. Let us transform the education system. And just before I finish, last week I was actually invited to give that performance that I just gave at the governing board, the governing council of the University of Leeds, which hosts the most senior members of staff in the university. And so pushing things like that, like I was literally saying things about white supremacy and they was just like, yeah, it's laughing it up. And I think that pushing things like that into spaces like that is a sign of decolonization beginning to come into action. Thank you.
begin because there's so many issues, but I think I might pick up on something that you just mentioned, Miles, which is actually the erasure of the British Empire and how that frames actually the whole colonial bias and mindset of actually all education in this country. I'm very aware of the fact that there's a national curriculum in the UK, and in that national curriculum, the British Empire does not feature as a compulsory part. You can go through your entire school education in the UK, as I'm sure many people here did, without being aware that Britain had an empire and the impact that had both on the entire world, but also the makeup of this country today and the situation particularly of people of colour, and what that means for how this country is structured. So I'm very aware that actually from the age of the earliest point of education through to university, there is erasure of the experiences of people of colour, but also of the violence of the British Empire. I suppose one of my questions is, how do we begin to counter that when from at every stage of education we're trying to fight against this? There's been amazing work through campaigns such as Why is my curriculum white in universities, individual student campaigns at different institutions across the country and indeed the world. But how can we contend with that when people don't even know what the British Empire is, what colonialism means?
I personally think there's lots of different ways of looking at that, I guess. So firstly, I think that one of the most interesting things about the national curriculum and how education is taught pre-16 largely is that they'll teach you about all the nice stuff. They'll teach you about that we had an industrial revolution, that we had this, that, the other, but not tell you about how that industrial revolution was funded and how it was fueled. And I think that literally is, in my opinion, one of the main reasons that there's this sense of this arrogance amongst in the British community about what is Britain and how far Britain has come, but all by itself, by just being great, and and that's why, in my opinion, you see things like Brexit. So for me, I didn't go to a very good school. It was an interesting experience, but there's different ways of speaking to people that come from areas like I did, and that's why I think that using music and using different vehicles that people that are able to enter the academy and enter academic spaces, once we've learnt stuff, I think we need to take it back to our communities and deliver it in the most personable way, in the way that we were taught before we got here, basically, in my opinion.
I think one of the things about the curriculum, especially the curriculum that my daughter's doing her A-levels right now, so I kind of have a very strong sense of what she's being taught by way of post-colonial or colonial history. She's just had about 10 seconds of the East India Company, nothing about the hundreds of years of colonization in the subcontinent. Is that the curriculum actually came together in the colony. It came together in the laboratory of the colony. It came together, these ideas of English ethnicity were kind of crystallized and galvanized because of the sort of, the kind of very agonistic contact between the colonized and the colonizer. So that's terribly important to remember about the curriculum. So it's inherently something that is exclusionary, or that it sort of has to very clearly demarcate that boundary between self and other. I think, at the risk of sort of, harping about, I think as somebody who has suffered, I am from an erstwhile colony, as somebody who has suffered from some of the sort of very long-term impacts of colonization, and the key thing in India today is the communalism that you see everywhere, the sort of Hindu-Muslim conflict that was very much a part of the infrastructure of empire. And I'm not saying that we couldn't have done better, or that we couldn't have erased that the violent history of partition, but as it stands, we are really sort of in a way living out a kind of a very, very problematic colonial legacy. I still feel that the way forward is not, to quote Derek Walcott, it's not recrimination and despair, but it is to find new ways, new recombinations of identity, which has to be international. So yes, I mean, we have to kind of, obviously say that I want to read Kant very critically and skeptically. I want to question his questions of enlightenment, but I still want to read it. I would want to see, if there is anything serviceable or usable, just as, my own resources were plundered, so even if we are using that sort of tit-for-tat kind of language, I would say that I would want to read it. I would want to consume it the way you consume my culture, and definitely read it in an international frame. And I think that is particularly important. So we can, and the curriculum is a particularly interesting pivot for that discussion, because the curriculum is not exactly British. I mean, when I first came here, every time people said, do you know where, let's say, the umbrella was invited, I kind of knew the answer would be something like Calcutta, because that's how it is, that, these sort of iconic emblems of Englishness as we know them were sort of in a way found elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's most curriculum is deeply political, and I think that there is sometimes an attempt to depoliticize it or actually make it seem like it's more innocent than it is. And I think a lot of the arguments that you can come up against in institutions when you're arguing for the curricular change or we don't have the staff to teach it, or for example, it's not that we don't want to, without recognising that that itself is a huge problem, that those individuals who do research in those areas and that research itself is not valued as much as others. So I was really glad to hear, the structural change at the very root of every aspect of higher education institutions being mentioned. One thing that I was particularly wondering about, that you mentioned, Anki, and I guess something that Mels and I have a bit of experience with, is the relationship of people who want to politically engage with the curriculum and change the way things happen at higher education institutions. As student activists, we have had many conversations with people from all levels of the university. I've no doubt that this is something that education officers, student campaigners have experienced up and down the country, where we get all kinds of arguments put up against us. And I think we would love to see institutions that want to work with us. Often we find that our academics who do want to work with us, and that's great, but the change we can impact through that is limited because of, as you mentioned, the deeper structural issues. And I think that the problem Mel's identified of institutions being afraid of people being critical of the ideologies that underpin, I guess, their livelihoods, feeling threatened by that. So I suppose my question is, how do we work with institutions to make the change possible that we really need to see, and in fact we must demand?
Because I'm really speaking from my own disciplinary perspective, and humanities is something that has a long memory. We don't really sort of discredit prior knowledge the way, let's say, IT specialist does. We don't need to sort of outgrow our past as rapidly as some other profession. So I think it's particularly difficult. In Oxford, one of the things that I actually like about the course is that it's fidelity to literary history, which is valuable, but I don't think it's an either or. I don't think that in order to introduce new elements, and as I was trying to say, that you can introduce new elements even when you're teaching a course that is not really seen as the kind of hippest, most international course, such as my 1760 to 1830, which is a little outside my specialism, which is probably why I still prepare for it. I still go to my tutorials nervously clutching index cards, But I really see there is so much that you can bring with that post-colonial way of reading, to the kind of the historical context of that period. So, two things. One is that, of course, we should open it up in terms of our graduate programs, in terms of, and the DPhils I supervise are, I would never in my dreams think of them as conventional. They range from literature and neuroscience to Victorian women traveling in Japan to kind of V.S. Naipaul as a Caribbean kind of writer. V.S. Naipaul is usually seen as a post-colonial writer, but V.S. Naipaul is a Caribbean writer, to sort of graphic novels about the Indian emergency. So they are terribly exciting. They keep me on my toes. So the postgraduate provision, where people actually have lots of choice, is not something I'm not that terribly worried about. I mean, I think what you're saying is that we have to kind of, in a way, pay more attention to the core curriculum and see how we can keep what's valuable in it without actually, without kind of also updating it and kind of using the currency of contemporary debates, contemporary questions to bear on them. If you ask somebody who teaches Anglo-Saxon to produce sort of a brown writer or a black writer, they won't be able to do it. But can they look at certain questions about gender and sexuality that speaks to our questions now? And the answer is probably yes. And that kind of scholarship is already happening. We need to find a way of, in a way, telling students that, look, we want to reach out to 19-year-olds whose attention span is shrinking for whatever reason, but who also have other kinds of literacy. I'm so envious of your digital nativehood, and so I think we need to kind of, in a way, all constantly sync the ways we receive and retain knowledge to the way you do, and I think that's that constant challenge of being on your toes will help us kind of also look at the core curriculum and see how we are sort of changing or revising or representing it, right?
And yeah, I definitely agree. I don't think that we should throw out the entire canon and I guess try and start again. But I think that the core problem is that some things in the current canon go unquestioned. And I feel like a lot, I've sat in, so as well as being an education officer at Leeds University, I'm studying a master's there in social and political thought. And I've literally sat in lecture theatres and had lecturers kind of say that when you try and question them about someone like Kant, they'll be like, oh, but that doesn't matter. What does that have to do with what he says here? What does that have to do with universal human rights? Universal human rights are, of course, unquestionable, etc., etc. And if we're really trying to do critical theory, which is what that master's is all about, then you need to be able to genuinely question everything and be able to throw whatever out you think needs to be thrown out and start and try and form those kind of arguments, but not throw everything at that, I guess. You can throw out as much as you want. But trying to form those kind of careful, considered arguments against what is in the current canon. And then looking from the education officer perspective of it, institutionally and structurally, how to try and influence a change in university management and how things seep through from there. So as Eden mentioned, I've been running the Why Is My Curriculum White campaign at Leeds for the past 2 years. And me positioned as education officer made that campaign a lot easier and not easier because God, it's been hard, but it made a lot of sense, and it meant that I had the access to the people that I needed to have the access to create the change that I have. But one thing that I've learned from the past 2 years is that can never be a campaign that sits solely within the institution. So it got to the point where I started all these provocative campaigns that saying all these things across campus and basically making everybody ask themselves, why is my curriculum white? And then it led to a paper that I took to the highest board of taught student education about some recommendations that the university could do to help it decolonize. And so that's been put into action in the university. But even though those things are in some way radical, once it's held by the institution, there's only so far it's going to be able to go. And so that campaign always needs to be strong on the outside of the university. And what I mean by that is that it needs to influence students to be able to ask their lecturers in every lecture, why are we learning about this? Why do you think this? Or what do you think about this in terms of things that they wouldn't have felt comfortable saying without the campaign? And so that's how I think that institutionally we can change that kind of structure.